orchestrated fresh Western romance narrative with new characters, avoided restricted names, structured emotional beats, orchestrated fresh Western romance narrative with new characters, avoided restricted names, structured emotional beats. The wagon road into Harrow Creek had a way of swallowing strangers whole, and the woman who stepped down off the noon stage that April afternoon looked like she'd been swallowed by something worse, and walked back out on her own 2 feet. She came carrying a single carpetbag and a tin box she held against her ribs. The way a person holds a thing, they'd die before they'd set down. Nobody in that mountain town knew yet that 200 miles behind her, a man with money enough to buy the whole county had already sworn he'd bring her back or bury whoever stood in his way. The rancher waiting for her didn't know it either. All he knew was that he'd asked for a plain, sensible wife who wouldn't trouble his quiet, and what came down those wooden steps into the Colorado dust was going to trouble every quiet thing he had left. Stay with me to the end of this one, and while you're here, tell me down in the comments what town you're listening from. I like knowing how far these stories travel. Wyatt Holloway had buried his first wife on a hill above the salt pasture 3 winters back, and in the time since, he had become a man other folks lowered their voices around. Ellen had died of the fever in 2 short weeks, and Wyatt had handled it the way he handled a fence post that wouldn't set. Jaw locked, hands moving, nothing in his face. He ran 200 head of cattle and a horse operation that limped along on his own stubbornness, and he hadn't spoken a soft word to anyone in so long he'd half forgotten he owned any. So when the notice he placed in the Denver paper finally drew a reply, he was honest about his terms in a way that made the postmaster raise an eyebrow. Rancher widowed seeks a practical wife. Must keep accounts, run a household, work without complaint. I cannot offer romance and will not pretend to. A fair partnership is all I have. 3 women had written back with talk of sunsets in the brave western heart, and Wyatt had fed those letters to the stove. The 4th was 4 lines long, written in a small, hard hand that didn't waste ink. I can keep books better than any man you'll hire. I can cook, mend, and stay out of your way. I am not looking for love. I am looking for a door that locks from the inside. If you can give me that, I'll give you everything else. That was signed only CA. He wrote back the date and the name of the town. She wrote back 1 word, coming. Now here she was. And the first thing Wyatt noticed, standing outside Tillery's boarding house with his hat in his fist, was that nothing about her was plain at all. She was younger than he'd guessed, maybe 26, 27, with dark copper hair pinned up tight and a face that would have turned heads in any city in the country, sharp cheekbones, a wide unsmiling mouth, and a pair of green eyes that swept the street the moment her boots hit the ground. Not the way a curious traveler looks at a new town. The way a hunted thing looks at a clearing. She marked the alley between the feed store and the bank, the open door of the livery, the road out the far end. She counted ways to run before she ever counted his face. Wyatt Holloway, she said. That's me. Clementine Ashby. She put out a hand, businesslike, and her grip was firmer than he expected. You can call me Clem. I'd rather not stand in the street if it's all the same to you. He hadn't expected that either. He'd had a small speech ready, awkward and rehearsed, and she cut it off at the knees with 3 sentences. He liked her at once and was annoyed at himself for it. They were married that same week by a circuit preacher in the front room of the courthouse, with Maud Tillery and the livery boy as witnesses, and it was the least romantic ceremony anyone in Harrow Creek could remember. Clem said her vows in a flat, clear voice and signed the register Clementine Ashby Holloway without a tremble in the line. Wyatt drove her out to the ranch in the buckboard, and she sat with the tin box on her lap the whole 11 miles, and didn't say a word until the house came into view against the foothills. You said in your letter the door locks from the inside, she said. Front and back, both. I'll get you a key tomorrow. She nodded once, like a person who'd been told a thing she needed to survive, and some of the rigidness went out of her shoulders for the first time since she'd stepped off that stage. For the first month, they lived like polite strangers sharing a roof. Clem took the small room off the kitchen. They'd agreed to that in writing before she came, and Wyatt was a man who kept his word. And she said about the ranch like she'd been born to it. She found his books in a shoebox under his bed, 3 years of unpaid attention, and she spread them across the kitchen table and went after them with a pencil and a frightening kind of focus. Inside a week, she'd found that the man who sold Wyatt his winter feed had been short-weighting every load by a tenth, and overcharging on top of it. She found that the buyer in Pueblo who took his yearlings had been pocketing the difference on a freight charge that didn't exist. She found near $400 in money that had quietly walked out of Wyatt's pockets while he'd been too grieved to look. "You've been getting robbed," she told him over supper, sliding a sheet of figures across to him. "Politely, but robbed. I fixed the contracts. The feed man's coming Thursday, and he's going to apologize." Wyatt looked at the numbers, then at her. "How'd you learn to read a ledger like that?" Something closed behind her eyes. "My father owed money to the wrong man. I learned to read every figure in every book that man kept, because my life depended on knowing exactly how much he said we owed and exactly how much we actually did." She gathered the papers. "That's all I'll say about it." He didn't push. A man who'd locked his own grief in a box for 3 years knew better than most when to leave a closed door closed. But the door didn't stay closed, because the man behind it came looking. There was a Tuesday, late in May, when the first rider came up the lane. Clem was hanging wash and she saw him before Wyatt did, and Wyatt, splitting rails at the corner of the corral, saw her go absolutely still, a wet shirt hanging from her hands, watching the road like the whole world had narrowed to it. The rider was a broad man in a good coat on a better horse. A man who smiled the way some men cock a pistol. He drew up at the gate and tipped his hat to her with elaborate courtesy. "Miss Ashby," he said. "Or is it Mrs. Holloway now? Word travels." "Royce." Her voice came out steady, but Wyatt had set down the maul and was crossing the yard, and he heard the cost of that steadiness. "You're a long way from home. Mr. Crane sent me to bring you a message." Royce Dunmore's eyes flicked to Wyatt, sized him up, and dismissed him, all in about a second. "He's prepared to be reasonable. The debt your daddy left, plus the embarrassment you caused running off. Mr. Crane will call it square. He just wants you home. Says a deal's a deal, and you were the last payment owed." "I'm married," Clem said. "Tell him that." Royce smiled wider. "He knows. He doesn't much care. A contract signed before a marriage stands ahead of one signed after. That's the law, ma'am, and Mr. Crane has a great deal of law on his side. Lawyers, judges, the kind that come to dinner. He gathered his reins. You've got 2 weeks to come back on your own. After that, Mr. Crane comes himself, and he won't be coming alone." He looked, finally, at Wyatt. "Whoever this is, he ought to think hard about what he's standing in front of." "He's not standing in front of anything," Wyatt said. It was the first thing he'd said, and it came out quiet. "He's standing next to his wife. You can tell Crane that too." Royce laughed, touched his hat, and rode off easy, like a man who'd already won and was only being patient about collecting. That night, Clem told him the rest of it, all of it, because she'd run out of road to keep it on. Thaddeus Crane was the richest man in 3 counties back east of the Divide. Cattle, the bank, a piece of the rail spur, his fingers in every contract that mattered. Clem's father had been a small rancher who'd borrowed from Crane's bank in a bad year and never climbed out from under it. When the debt grew past what land and cattle could cover, Crane had proposed a different kind of payment. He was a widower himself, 58 years old, and he wanted a young wife who could keep his books and decorate his table and give him an heir, and he'd looked at Clem the way he looked at a parcel of land he intended to own. Her father, drowning, had signed a paper promising her. Then her father had died of his own bad heart, and Crane had moved his date up, and Clem had climbed out, a second-story window in the dark, bribed a stable hand with the last of her mother's jewelry, and ridden 200 miles to answer the only advertisement she could find that asked for a woman who wanted no romance and no questions. "He'll really come," she said. She was sitting at the kitchen table with the tin box open in front of her, and Wyatt saw now that it was full of papers. Copies, ledger pages, letters in a cramped accountant's hand. "He doesn't lose. He'll find a judge who owes him, and he'll have me declared his by contract. Or worse, he'll find a doctor who owes him, and have me declared not in my right mind, unfit to choose for myself. He's done it to a tenant who crossed him. Put her away in a home in St. Louis, and took her land. I watched him do it and toast it after dinner." She pressed her fingers to her eyes. You didn't sign up for this. I lied by leaving it out of my letter. If you want to send me back, I'll understand. It might even keep your ranch standing." Wyatt was quiet a long moment. Outside, a coyote called and another answered it. "Why'd you bring all those papers?" he asked. She blinked. "What?" "You ran out a window in the dark with what you could carry, and what you chose to carry was a box of his ledgers." He nodded at the tin. "You didn't run to hide, Clem. Not all the way. Some part of you grabbed those because you meant to use them someday." "Didn't you?" For the first time since she'd come, her composure broke. Just a crack, a glitter of water in those hard green eyes. "I copied them for 2 years," she whispered. "Every figure he cooked. Every debt he doubled. Every man he ruined on paper. I told myself I'd burn them. But I couldn't." "Then we're not sending you anywhere," Wyatt said. "We're going to Denver, and we're going to find a lawyer, and you're going to put that box on his desk." He stood and set his cup in the basin. "I buried one wife in ground I couldn't fight. I'm not about to hand the second one to a man over a piece of paper." "You're staying. We'll see this through standing up." She looked at him like she was checking whether he was real or a thing she dreamed up out of want. "Why?" she said. "You don't love me. We agreed to that." "No," he said. "We didn't agree to anything about how I'd feel in a month. We just agreed I wouldn't pretend." He stood in the doorway a moment. "I'm not pretending now." The lawyer's name was Ezra Whitfield, and he had an office above a Denver hardware store with a view of the mountains and a stack of cases that told you he took the ones nobody else would. He listened to the whole story without once interrupting, smoking a cold pipe he never lit, and when Clem finally set the tin box on his desk and opened it, he leaned forward and went very still. "This is a catastrophe," he said at last. Clem's face fell. "You won't take it." "I didn't say that." He took a ledger copy out and held it to the light. "I said it's a catastrophe. Thaddeus Crane has money, judges in his vest pocket, and the patience to drag this through every court in the territory until you're broke or dead. The contract your father signed is real, and there are courts in this country that'll honor a dead man's promise of his daughter like she's a heifer. If we go in there and argue you got the right to choose your own husband, half those old men on the bench will laugh us out the door." He set the page down. "So we don't argue that." "Then what do we argue?" Wyatt said. "We don't put Clem on trial." Whitfield's eyes had gone bright and cold. "We put Crane on trial. He's coming to court to claim a debt." "Fine. We make the court look at the debt. Because if these books are what I think they are, that man didn't take an honest debt and call it a daughter. He forged the figures. He doubled what was owed, charged interest he invented, and built a number on paper that no honest man could ever pay, so that no payment but a person would ever clear it. He tapped the ledger. A man can claim a contract. He can't claim a contract built on fraud. We don't say Clem is too good to be sold. We prove the price was a lie. And the woman who can stand in that courtroom and walk that judge through every cooked figure, line by line until the fraud is plain to a child. He looked at Clem. Is the same woman they'll be trying to call too foolish to manage her own affairs. Let them try. You'll know those books better than the man who wrote them." "And if the judge is bought?" Clem asked. "Then remake the fraud so plain, so loud, in front of so many people, that buying the verdict costs Crane more than letting you go ever would." Whitfield finally struck a match and lit the pipe. "I won't lie to you. The odds are bad. But bad isn't none." They had 11 days before the hearing, and Clem spent every one of them at the kitchen table, with a lamp burning past midnight, reconstructing 2 years of theft from memory and her copied pages. Wyatt brought her coffee and sat across from her in the dark and learned to read a ledger himself, just well enough to help her check her work. And somewhere in those long nights the polite distance between them quietly went away. It wasn't any one moment. It was 1,000 small ones. The way she'd push a plate of supper toward him without being asked. The way he started leaving the lamp full of oil so she wouldn't have to get up. The way, one night near 2 in the morning, she fell asleep over the books and he carried the box to her room and laid a quilt over her shoulders and stood in the doorway longer than he had any reason to. Crane came to Harrow Creek himself 2 days before the hearing, exactly as Royce had promised, riding up the lane in a tailored coat with 3 men behind him. He was tall and silver and handsome in the way of men who've never once been told no, and he sat his horse in Wyatt's yard and looked at the ranch with open contempt. "So this is what you ran to," he said to Clem, who had come out onto the porch with Wyatt beside her. "A mudlot and a man who can't keep his own fences." His eyes moved over her slowly, possessively. "You were always too clever for your own good, Clementine. Clever enough to copy my books, I expect. I know you took them. It won't matter. By Friday afternoon a judge will hand you back to me, and we'll go home, and you'll spend the rest of your life learning that the smartest thing you ever did was the most useless." He smiled. "I'd advise the rancher to be elsewhere when I collect." "You're on my land, Crane," Wyatt said. "Say what you came to say and ride off it." Crane smiled, didn't move. "I came to look at the both of you," he said pleasantly. "So I'd remember your faces when this is over." He turned his horse. "Friday, 9 o'clock. Don't be late, dear. The court doesn't like to wait, and neither do I." Friday came gray and cold off the mountains. The Denver courtroom was full. Crane had brought lawyers and a gallery of men he owned, and they filled the front benches like a wall. He had a judge, too, a heavy, tired man named Renfrew who'd taken a great many dinners at Crane's table and who looked at Whitfield's table like he'd already decided how the day would end. Crane's lawyer was a smooth, gray article named Pollard, and he opened by laying the contract on the bench like a winning hand. A debt of $11,000 secured by a signed promise, a daughter who'd fled her lawful obligation, a simple matter, he said, of a court honoring a dead man's word and a living man's right. He called Clem nervous, fanciful, prone to fits of imagination. He suggested gently that a woman who'd climb out a window in the night and ride alone across the territory might not be entirely sound, that her flight itself was evidence she could not be trusted to govern her own affairs. He asked the court to return her to her guardian, Mr. Grode, Crane, who out of Christian charity was still willing to take her in. Then Whitfield stood up. "Your Honor," he said, "my colleague keeps saying $11,000. I'd like to know how a man who borrowed $2,000 came to owe $11,000. He walked to the bench. "And I'd like Mrs. Holloway to be the one who shows you, because she kept the records this man thought no one was keeping." Clem took the stand. Crane watched her with the calm of a man who'd already won, and Pollard rose to object, and Renfrew waved a heavy hand, and then Clem began to talk, and the room changed. She didn't weep. She didn't plead. She opened the first ledger and she walked Judge Renfrew through it the way a surgeon walks an audience through a body. Here was the original loan, $2,000, dated and clean. Here, 3 months later, the same loan rewritten as $2,800, with no payment and no explanation. Here was an interest charge of 40% where the note said 8. Here was a freight cost billed twice. Here was a penalty invented out of air, and here was Crane's own clerk's hand recording the real number in a private book Clem had copied. A real debt of $900, paid down to $200 before her father died, sitting right beside the public book that screamed $11,000. "He didn't lend my father money," she said, and her voice never rose and never shook. "He lent him a trap. He kept 2 sets of books, one for the world and one for himself. And the difference between them was always going to be paid in a person, because no honest amount of money could ever close a debt that was invented to never close. I know this because I copied both books for 2 years while he planned to make me the payment." She turned the ledger so the gallery could see. "If I am too foolish to manage my own affairs, Your Honor, then I'd ask the court how a fool reconstructed 2 years of a banker's fraud from memory. And if I'm not a fool, then the only thing standing between me and my own life is a debt that this man wrote with his own hand to be a lie." The courtroom had gone dead silent. Even the men Crane owned were looking at the ledger. Pollard tried. He bullied, he objected, he called her figures fancy and her copies forged. But Whitfield had one more card, and he played it then. He called a witness Clem hadn't known was coming. Maud Tillery, who ran the Harrow Creek boarding house, who had driven all the way to Denver in her Sunday coat and now climbed into the box with her chin set like a fence rail. Maud had spent 30 years reading people for a living, she said, and she'd watched this young woman keep a ranch's books, face down a feed cheat, and build a household out of nothing in 2 months flat. "You want to know if she's in her right mind," Maud said, looking straight at Renfrew. She's got more right mind than every man in this room put together, and that's including the bench. Now I've said my piece, and I'll thank you not to ask me to pretend otherwise." A laugh went through the gallery before Renfrew could gavel it down, and it was the kind of laugh that turns a room, the sound of ordinary people deciding whose side they were on. Judge Renfrew called a recess and was gone 40 minutes. When he came back, his face had changed, and Crane saw it before anyone else did. A bought judge can deliver a quiet verdict in an empty room. He cannot hand a rich man a daughter in a courtroom full of witnesses who just watched the fraud proved line by line, not without staking his own neck on it. Renfrew was tired and he was crooked, but he was not a man willing to hang for Thaddeus Crane's wedding. "This court finds the debt instrument fraudulent on its face," Renfrew said heavily, "and any contract secured by it void. The claim is dismissed." He looked at Clem, and something almost like shame crossed his heavy face. "Mrs. Holloway is free to go." "The court suggests Mr. Holloway is free to go." "The court suggests Mr. Crane consult his own attorneys regarding the matter of the second set of books, which this court is forwarding to the territorial attorney." It was over in a sentence. Crane stood, white to the lips, and for one moment the whole mask came off, and the gallery saw exactly what he was. Then he gathered it back up, put on his hat, and walked out, and the men who owned half a county walked out behind him, and not one of them looked at him on the way. Clem didn't cry until they were outside on the courthouse steps in the cold gray light. And then she cried all at once, hard, the way a person cries when a thing they've braced against their whole life finally lets go. Wyatt stood next to her, beside her, not in front of her, the way he'd stood from the start. And he didn't tell her to stop, and he didn't say it would all be fine. He just put his arm around her shoulders and let her shake until she was done. They went home to Harrow Creek, and they were quiet a long while. And then late that night, sitting at the kitchen table that had become the center of both their lives, Clem said, "What are we now?" Wyatt knew what she meant. They'd never spoken of it. Partners, yes. Friends, somewhere along the way. But there was a thing under the words they'd both been stepping around for weeks. "What do you want us to be?" he said. "Something real." She turned her cup in her hands. "Not an arrangement, not a door that locks from the inside. Something that's mine because I chose it, not because I was running toward it." She looked up. "I spent my whole life being someone's payment, someone's property. I don't want to be safe with you, Wyatt. Safe was the window I climbed out of. I want to be home with you. There's a difference, and I've waited 27 years to feel it." "Then that's what we'll be." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she let him, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. "I'm scared," she finally said. "I'm scared this is the part where it falls apart." "I'm scared too," he said. "I buried Ellen, telling myself I'd never let anybody close enough to lose again. And then you got off that stage and read my books and told me I was being robbed, and I've been losing the argument with myself every day since." He turned her hand over in his. "I'd rather be scared next to you than safe by myself. I had safe. It's a cold way to live." She came around the table then, slow, the way a person crosses a frozen creek, testing each step. She put her hand against his jaw like she was making sure he was real and wouldn't disappear. He didn't disappear. "I love you," she said, and the words came out rough, like they'd cost her something to dig up. "I don't think I've ever said that to a living soul and meant it. So I'm only going to say it the once tonight, and then I'll say it the rest of my life if you'll let me." "I love you too," Wyatt said, "and you can say it as many times as you want. I'll never get tired of being somebody's choice instead of somebody's plan." They were married a second time that summer. Really married, this time, in the little white church in Harrow Creek, with half the county in the pews. Because the story of the woman who'd unraveled Thaddeus Crane line by line had traveled fast and folks wanted to lay eyes on her. Crane himself was gone by then. The territorial attorney had taken an interest in those 2 sets of books, and a man with that much to hide had found pressing reasons to be elsewhere. Royce Dunmore drifted off after his money did. The danger that had trailed Clem 200 miles simply ran out of fuel, the way most bullies do when somebody finally proves they were never as solid as they claimed. The ranch turned a corner. Clem's name spread, and inside a year she was keeping the books for half the spreads in the valley, the only bookkeeper in 3 counties that nobody dared cheat. Wyatt built up his herd and got known for honest stock and a fair handshake. They hired on a young hand who'd lost his own family's place and needed somewhere to land. The fences got fixed. The house filled up with the noise of a life being lived instead of just gotten through. A daughter came 2 springs later. They named her June, after Clem's mother, and she had her father's stubborn jaw and her mother's sharp green eyes. And from the time she could talk, she had opinions about everything and refused, on principle, to be told what to do. Wyatt would watch Clem reading to her in the lamplight at night. The old tin box, long since emptied of its terrible papers and refilled with letters and ribbon, and a single photograph of a grandmother, June, would never meet, and he'd think about what a near thing it had all been. A window in the dark. A 4-line letter. A box of stolen ledgers. A frightened woman couldn't make herself burn. You ever think about how close we came to not happening? Clem asked him one warm evening on the porch, watching June chase the barn cats across the yard. Sometimes, he said, I asked for plain and quiet. I'd have spent my whole life plain and quiet and never known what I was missing. I asked for a door that locked, she said, and laughed a little. I got a whole house that doesn't have to. June caught a cat, got scratched for her trouble, and immediately went after the next one, undeterred. They watched her go. She's going to be a handful, Clem said. She already is. Good. Clem leaned into him, and the sun went down red behind the mountains the way it does out there, lighting up the whole valley gold for a few minutes before the dark. Let her be a handful. Let her be loud and clever and impossible to sell. The world's going to spend her whole life trying to make her smaller and quieter and easier to own. She's not going to learn that here. No, Wyatt said, and put his arm around his wife in the last of the light. She's not. And that was the truth of it, in the end, that the best things a person gets are hardly ever the ones they planned. Wyatt Holloway had ordered a plain wife to keep his quiet, and he'd gotten a woman who blew the quiet all to pieces and gave him back his life in the bargain. Clementine had run for a place to hide and found, instead of a hiding place, a home she'd chosen with her own 2 hands and her own clear eyes, which is a far rarer and braver thing. They were neither of them perfect. They argued. They carried old fears, but they carried them together, out there in the gold light under the mountains, in a house with doors that didn't need to lock, where a difficult little girl was learning every single day that she belonged to no one but herself. I keep coming back to that tin box. A frightened woman climbs out a window in the dark with only what she can carry, and out of everything she owns, she chooses to carry the very thing that could get her killed. I used to think that was foolish. Now I think it was the bravest thing in the whole story. Clem didn't grab jewelry or money. She grabbed the truth, copied out in her own careful hand over 2 long years, because some stubborn part of her refused to believe that a lie should be allowed to stand just because a powerful man wrote it down. That's the thing I want to sit with. Crane had everything. The bank, the judges, the men who came to dinner. Clem had a box of paper and a clear head. And the reason she walked out of that courtroom free isn't luck. It's cause and effect, plain as a fence line. A debt built on a lie can't survive somebody who knows the numbers cold. Crane spent years making himself feared. Clem spent those same years making herself impossible to fool. When the two finally met in front of Judge Renfrew, the fear cracked and the knowledge held. Because that's what knowledge does when you've actually earned it. But knowing the books wasn't enough by itself. Plenty of people see the truth and swallow it because fighting costs too much. What carried Clem was that she would not be owned, and she'd already proved it the night she chose a cold stagecoach over a warm cage. Grit isn't loud. Hers wasn't. It was a woman sitting at a kitchen table past midnight, reconstructing a man's crimes line by line, refusing to quit when the lawyer himself said the odds were bad. And then there's Wyatt, who could have sent her back and kept his ranch safe and quiet. He didn't. He stood beside her, not in front of her, and the difference in those 2 words is the whole difference between a man who protects you and a man who respects you. He chose to do the decent thing when the easy thing was right there, and that choice cost him sleep and money and peace, and he made it anyway. So when I think about what I'd want my own children to carry off that stagecoach into their own dark, it's those 3 things. A spine that won't bend to whoever's loudest. A mind sharp enough that no one can rewrite your truth on you. and the plain decency to stand beside the people who need you, even when standing aside would be safer. Clem and Wyatt didn't build that ranch out of romance. They built it out of those three, stacked one on the other like rails on a fence. The world will always have its cranes. What it can't manufacture and can't buy is a person who knows the numbers, won't be sold, and chooses right anyway.